Alright, man. Broly and Invincible episode 13. Alright, we coming to the end of this thing. Let's get it. Or the end of season 1 at least. Let's go. The silence that followed the cataclysmic halt of Omni-Man's fist was profound, broken only by the faint panicked rasp of Adamese breathing behind him. Broly didn't move, his hands still locked around Nolan's knuckles, his own massive frame a statue of contained power. The man he knew, Mark's father and Debbie's husband, the stoic but steady presence in the house that had become his home, seemed to be gone. Omni-Man's eyes, usually so composed, were wide with a mixture of shock and a flicker of genuine annoyance. He flexed his arm, his Viltrumite muscles corded with impossible strength, and with a sharp, grunting effort, he wrenched his fist free from Broly's grasp. The sound of the release like rock grinding against rock. He took a single, measured step back, not in retreat, but to appease this new, unforeseen obstacle. A slow, ugly frown spread across his bloodied face, a stark contrast to the paternal mask that he usually wore. It was a face of pure, unadulterated contempt. Well, well, Nolan's voice was low, mocking drawl devoid of any warmth, if it isn't the friendly giant. The quiet little mouse who eats Debbie's meatloaf and sleeps in the guest room. His gaze swept over Broly's powerful form with clinical disdain. Come to be a good little guard dog for the livestock, to protect the mayflies from the farmer. Broly recoiled as if physically struck. The words, livestock, mayflies, they were so alien, so vile, so utterly disconnected from the man who had just days ago placed a comforting hand on his shoulder and praised his decision to exile himself. This wasn't the Omni-Man he knew. This was a stranger wearing a familiar face, his words dripping with a venom that poisoned the very memory of the kindness that Broly had received in that house. Broly's gaze finally broke Omni-Man's sneer, sweeping across the devastated mountaintops, his eyes sharp with a new chilling clarity. He took in the brutalized forms of his friends. He saw Immortal cradling his shattered arm, his ancient body broken up. He saw Monster Girl with her face a mess of blood and fractured bones, whimpering softly. He saw Rex pale and clutching his bloody bicep, and the dozens of duplicates' fallen forms riddled with some shrapnel. Mark lay in a crater, struggling to rise up, his face a mask of tears and violet red blood. A cold fire ignited in Broly's gut, but it was not the mindless inferno of the Ikari state. This was a focused, crystalline rage. He would not lose control. Not here. Not with them in the crossfire. He turned his head back to Omni-Man, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that cut through the wind. We will finish this somewhere else, Broly stated. It was not a request or a challenge. It was a simple, non-negotiable declaration. They will not be harmed by our clash. Omni-Man let out a short, derisive laugh, the sound ugly and out of place. Look at you, he mocked, shaking his head with theatrical pity. So concerned for these fleas that feed off of your vessel. You stand there with power in your veins that could crack this country in half, and your first thought is to tiptoe around the fragile, temporary things that are scurrying beneath you. Pathetic. He took a step closer, his eyes gleaming with cruel insight. You're just like my son. You have the strength of a demigod, but you let a human heart leash you. You fret over their fleeting lives, their insignificant pains. It's a sickness, a failure of perspective. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial, condescending whisper. These people you're so desperate to protect, Broly, they are a single, brief season. Beings like you and I, we are the turning of the ages. To worry about crushing a few blades of grass underfoot when you are a hurricane is the height of absurdity. They are lesser. Their safety is irrelevant. Your concern for them is a weakness that they have planted within you, just as they tried to do with Mark. He gestured dismissively at the wounded heroes. This sentimentality is what holds you back from truly understanding your power. You should be thinking of how to use this world, not how to coddle it. But you can't see it. You're so busy playing the good little pet, the guard dog, for this family that you've forgotten what you really are. You are a weapon. And a weapon does not worry about the collateral damage. Broly spoke up in defense. I am not a weapon, and my strength does not define me, he spoke with a slightly raised voice and then clenched his fist. I fight for the others I wish to protect. A final narrowing of Omni-Man's eyes ended the conversation. It seems Marcus is the only one who needs to learn to let go. The final contemptuous word from Omni-Man's lips, go, was still hanging in the air when the world between them detonated. They moved not as two beings, but as opposing forces of nature, deciding to cancel each other out. There was no run-up, no battle cry. One moment they were standing 30 feet apart. The next, the space between them ceased to exist, replaced by a vacuum and a shockwave that flattened the remaining standing rock for a 100-yard radius. Their fists met in a silent, then deafening annihilation of sound. The initial impact was a vacuum, sucking the air from lungs of every onlooker, before the reality of the collision caught up with a cracoon that was less a sound and more a physical event. A dome of visible force, shimmering emerald and faint pink from the residual energy of Omni-Man's charge, erupted outwards. The very top of the mountain peak sheared off, a colossal slab of stone sliding away in a grinding avalanche that thundered into the valleys below. Broly's boots dug furrows into the bedrock, but he did not yield an inch. His focus was absolute, a scalpel's edge in the hurricane of his own power. He saw the flicker of surprise in Omni-Man's eyes, the first genuine crack in the Viltrumite's arrogant facade, and then he used it. Instead of meeting force with brute stationary force, Broly pivoted on his back foot, and he wrapped his other hand around Omni-Man's still extended forearm, not to stop the power, but to redirect it. With a grunt of effort that tore from his chest, he used Nolan's own world-shattering momentum against him, spinning and heaving the Viltrumite upward and away from the fallen heroes. Omni-Man was hurled skyward like a cannonball, a streak of red and white against the bruised night sky, but he was not so easily dispatched as he twisted in midair, arresting his flight. His face a mask of incandescent fury. He opened his mouth to roar another insult, but Broly was already there. Broly had followed his throw, a green-tinged phantom ascending without a sound. He didn't swing a wild punch. He slammed his entire body into Omni-Man, wrapping his arms around the Viltrumite's torso in a crushing tackle. The air screamed around them as Broly became the engine, his flight path a deliberate upward vector aimed at the stratosphere. You think distance will save them? Nolan snarled into his ear, hammering a series of brutal short-range elbows into Broly's back. Each impact was a conscious blast that would have pulverized the battleship, a concussed blast, but Broly absorbed them, his Saiyan biology and sheer will forging his body into an anvil against the Viltrumite's hammer. He did not reply, he did not roar, he simply flew faster, the clouds shredding into mist around them as they broke the sound barrier and then doubled it. Broly's plan was horrifyingly simple. He would take this fight to a stage where there's nothing left to break but each other. He led the traitorous hero away from the world he claimed to own into the silent edge of the Earth's sky, where the only collateral damage would be the one he intended to inflict. The world shrunk to a screaming, thinning rush. The vibrant blues and whites of the planet below faded into the stark blackness of the upper atmosphere. The air, once a substance Broly could push against, was becoming more of a vacuum, offering no resistance and no sustenance. A sharp cold pressure built within his chest, not from Omni-Man's blows, but from the simple brutal fact of emptiness. His lungs, mighty and efficient, strained to pull in molecules that were no longer there. A Saiyan's biology was rugged, but it was not built for the void. His vision began to speckle with dark spots, the first warnings of hypoxia. Omni-Man held fast in Broly's unbreakable grip, and he felt the change instantly. The Saiyan's relentless, powerful ascent faltered by a fraction. The muscles around his ribs clenched in a vice-like hold, twitched with an involuntary spasm. Nolan's lips peeled back from his teeth in a grim, understanding smile. He didn't need to breathe. For a long time, not really. The thin trace gases, gases, it was all negligible to the perfected Viltrumite biology. So this was his domain. The air's a little thin up here, isn't it, boy? Nolan's voice was a contemptuous rumble, barely needed to carry in the near silence. With a sudden explosive flex of his shoulders and back, he broke Broly's hold. For a critical half-second, Broly was disoriented, his body screaming for oxygen, his focus divided between the enemy and the failing environment around him. It was all the opening that Omni-Man needed. He pivoted in a void, a predator perfectly adapted to his element. His fist clad in the red fabric of his costume became a piston of condensed fury. It wasn't a wild swing, it was precise, a devastating short-range jab, putting the full weight of his body and his contempt behind it. The impact connected squarely with Broly's jaw. The crack of the blow was muffled, stolen by the thin air, but the force was undiminished. Broly's head snapped to the side, a spray of saliva tinged with pink with blood, crystallizing instantly with a tiny cloud of frozen droplets. The strike didn't just carry pain, it carried the shocking realization of his disadvantage. He was flung backward, not with the force of a building shattering impact, but with enough momentum to send him tumbling, end over end, through the high, silent battlefield. The earth below was a distant curve, and for a terrifying moment, Broly was adrift, gasping in a realm that was trying to kill him as surely as the Viltrumite he faced. He had not taken into account the harshness of this environment. He'd never been this high before. Stabilizing his tumble, Broly shook his head, the ringing in his ears fading faster than the ache within his jaw. A crucial data point clicked into place amidst the dizziness. The punch had been powerful, unquestionably. It had cracked against his face with the force of a meteor strike, but it lacked the ferocious foundational power and weight of Battle Beast blows. The Leonine warrior's attacks remained the hardest hits he'd ever come across. Omni-Man's, by comparison, were a brutal assault on his body, but a grim relief steadied him. He could withstand the damage. The Viltrumite was not physically superior to him. But the victory of the realization was immediately soured by a sharp burning demand in his chest. His lungs clawed at the climate of thin air. The speckles in his vision returned, a dizzying constellation of static. The true enemy here wasn't Nolan's fists. It was the suffocating indifference of space itself that was right on over the horizon. His Saiyan biology, forged in Monster Island's thick atmosphere and Earth's comfortable gravity, was rebelling. Every cell was screaming for oxygen that was barely available. A new cold strategy began to form, cutting through the gathering mental fog. He had to descend, to bring the fight back to a level where he could breathe comfortably, where his body could function at its peak. But it wouldn't be a simple retreat, as Omni-Man, perfectly at home in this lethal expanse, would know exactly what he was doing. The plan was clear, and its cost was equally so. He would have to fight his way down. He would have to engage, withstand the Viltrumite's attacks, and gradually, stubbornly drag the battle back through the thinning air towards the life-giving troposphere, perhaps using the cloud cover as both a landmark and a tactical veil. It was a brutal game of attrition, one where every foot of altitude gained would be paid for in blood and bruising. He tightened his fists, emerald energy flickering around them like a distress beacon. The descent would be a war in of itself. The burning ache in his lungs was a ticking clock. Broly's vision swam, the star-dusted blackness of the upper atmosphere beginning to blur at the edges. He couldn't afford a prolonged exchange up here. Every moment, every burst of power consumed precious oxygen his body was desperately screaming for. A new grim strategy solidified in his oxygen-deprived mind: conservation through controlled counterattacks. He would let Omni-Man come to him. He stood his feet in the sky, a seeming statue of exhaustion, his arms held loosely at his sides, his breathing a ragged, shallow pull at the thin air. Omni-Man saw the opening instantly, a predator sensing weakness. Running out of steam already, he taunted, his voice unnaturally clear in the near silence. He became a crimson blur, a straight line of murderous intent aimed at Broly's seemingly undefended torso. His fist aimed for Broly's solar plexus was a spear meant to puncture and or paralyze. But Broly was waiting. At the last possible microsecond, his left forearm snapped up, a dense wall of muscle and bone deflecting the punch inward past his ribs. The impact was staggering, a shockwave of pure force that Broly absorbed with a grunt, letting it dissipate through his massive frame. But he didn't retreat. Using the brief moment of contact, the split second where Omni-Man's arm was extended and his balance committed, Broly pivoted on his hip, his right fist coiled and loaded with the last dregs of his full strength. Breath lashed out in a short, devastating hook. It connected with a crack that was more felt than heard. A sickening percussion of flesh and bone. Omni-Man's head snapped sideways, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated shock. A spray of dark Viltrumite red blood looking like red ink in the starlight, erupted from his mouth and nose. The force of the counterblow sent him spinning backward and end over end through the void, his controlled charge utterly broken up. Broly stood panting, his knuckles stinging, buying himself a few more precious seconds of reprieve and a few thousand feet of descent as Nolan struggled to right himself. Omni-Man stabilized his tumble, a hand flying to his jaw. The shock of the blow was eclipsed only by the rage that followed. The sheepdog of the lambs had drawn blood. Again. He wiped the dark smear from his lips, his eyes narrowing into slits of cold, calculating fury. He had underestimated the boy's resilience and tactical adaptability. He wouldn't make that mistake again. He saw Broly gasping, the tell signs of severe hypoxia in the silent tremor of his hands and the desperate heave of his chest. The Saiyan was strong, sure, but he was chained to a failing biology in comparison to his Viltrumite DNA. This time, Omni-Man didn't change with a straightforward punch, or charge with a straightforward punch. He feinted, darting, and as if to retreat his previous attack. As expected, Broly's arms came up in the same defensive block, his body coiling for another punishing counter, but Nolan was ready this time. At the last instant, he dropped beneath Broly's guard with the fluid grace of a viper. Instead of striking his arm shot upward, snaking inside Broly's guard and locking around the Saiyan's biceps. In one powerful fluid motion, he spun his back to Broly's chest and yanked the massive arms over his shoulder and locked his hands behind Broly's neck. A perfect, inescapable full Nelson. Strength is nothing without endurance, boy. Nolan grunted, his voice a vicious whisper in Brolin's ear. Broly roared, a sound that was thin and choked in the vacuum, his immense muscles bulging as he tried to break the hold, but Nolan had all the leverage, and his Viltrumite physiology was barely taxed in this environment. Let's take you to a place where that strength of yours is truly meaningless. With a powerful surge from his legs, Omni-Man rocketed upward, dragging and struggling, choking Broly with him. He became a living rocket, pushing them higher and higher away from the life-giving atmosphere into the true airless killing cold of deep space. The blue marble of Earth began to shrink noticeably beneath them, a beautiful, terrible sight. As Broly's world started to go dark at the edges, his struggling growing weaker. Consciousness was a flickering candle for Broly. The blackness wasn't just at the edges of his vision now. It was swallowing him whole. The terrifying silence of the void was broken only by the frantic thumping echo of his own struggling heart that was in his ears. He could feel his body beginning to shut down, his limbs growing heavy and numb in Omni-Man's grapple hold to descend. He had to break the grapple, and to break the grapple he needed a moment of shocking, disorienting pain. Summoning the last dregs of his will, Broly stopped, trying to pull Nolan's arms apart. Instead, he jerked his own head backward with all his remaining might. The back of his skull, harder than any terrestrial alloy, smashed directly into Omni-Man's face. Crunch. Nolan snarled in pain and surprise. Ah! His grip loosened by a fraction. Broly did it again. And again. A brutal, primitive headbutting barrage that sent jolts of white-hot pain through both of their skulls. Enough! Omni-Man roared, his nose now bleeding freely. To maintain control of the grapple and stop the concussive assault, he was forced to angle his body, tilting them both. The new orientation pointed their tangling forms not upward, but on a steep diagonal trajectory down. A cruel, brilliant idea sparked within Nolan's mind. He wouldn't just let the boy suffocate. That was no longer an option. He could make him an example, however. He would make him a weapon against the world he so foolishly wanted to protect. You want to go down so badly? Nolan sneered, tightening his hold and pouring on the speed. Fine. Let's go down. He angled their locked bodies into a controlled supersonic dive. The thin air began to scream around them. First a whistle, then a roar, then a shriek as they ripped back into the atmosphere. The friction turned their bodies into a meteor of flesh and blood, writhed in hellish fire. Omni-Man, protected by his position and biology, kept Broly dazed, oxygen-starved, and taking the full brunt of the heat and force locked in front of him like a shield. He took aim not at a barren mountain or an empty ocean, but at the glowing grid-like pattern of city lights directly beneath their dive path. He would use the sand as his kinetic payload and make Broly personally responsible for the crater of death that he was about to create. Consciousness returned to Broly not with a gentle dawn, but with the screaming fire of re-entry and the horrifying zooming clarity of street grids and skyscrapers. He blinked, his oxygen-starved brain struggling to process the sight. This wasn't a training ground or a deserted mountain. Through the plasma haze, he saw the tiny distant specks of cars, the illuminated windows of apartments, the fragile web of a city asleep. Omni-Man's plans snapped into focus with chilling, monstrous clarity. No. The thought was a silent, desperate scream. He strained against the Viltrumite's hold, his muscles screaming in protest, his ki flaring in a panicked emerald burst, but it was too little too late. They were a meteor now, and physics was a cruel, unyielding force. And the world ended in a single, multi-sensory cataclysm. The sound was the first thing to die, swallowed by the absolute percussive of impact. It was a noise that wasn't heard but felt, a physical blow that hit the city like the fist of a great giant. The ground beneath them didn't just crack, it liquefied, erupting upward in a tidal wave of pavement, soil, and shattered concrete. A shockwave of pure force radiated outwards at supersonic speed, and the city answered with a symphony of destruction. For blocks in every direction, windows simply ceased to exist, exploding inward in a glittering storm of glass dust. Weaker structures, brownstones, storefronts, parking garages, shuttered and collapsed like houses of cards. The peoples closest to the epicenter, those in the apartments and the streets that were instantly vaporized into the expanded crater, were eliminated, not with a scream, but with the silent, physics-rending pop. They were just gone. Missed. Broly, taking the brunt of the impact at the crater's heart, felt the world dissolve into a deafening, shuddering hail. He lay in the molten core of the devastation, dazed, his body slightly aching, but his mind was horrifyingly clear. The dust began to settle, revealing the silhouettes of mangled skyscrapers against the firelit sky. The first screams, thin and distant, began to pierce the ringing in his ears. He had tried to be a shield, but he had become a weapon, and the proof of his failure lay in the ruins all around him. A groan, low in pain, rumbled in Broly's chest as he pushed himself up from the smoldering, glass-strewn rubble. The world swam back into focus with brutal clarity. The ringing in his ears was now a dissonant orchestra of distant, terrified screams and the approaching frantic wail of sirens. The air was thick with pulverized concrete, and the acrid smell of ozone and burnt wiring burned within his lungs with every ragged breath. He stood in the heart of a wound carved into the city, a crater hundreds of feet wide, its edges glowing with molten rock and flickering electrical fires. The silhouettes of broken buildings leaned precariously against the smoke-choked sky. Then a figure descended, landing with a gentle, insulting grace on the crater's lip. Omni-Man stood there, pristine amidst the chaos, his cape barely stirring in the hot, toxic winds. He looked down at Broly, not with rage, but with a chilling, academic curiosity. See? Nolan's voice cut through the cacophony, calm and didactic. You stand. A little bruised, perhaps, but you stand. Your biology, your power, it allowed you to survive. What would reduce any of these people to mist? He gestured with a casual, sweeping hand at the devastation, at the unseen thousands buried under the rubble. That is the point that you refuse to grasp. We are not the same as these fragile, temporary things. Their lives are brief, loud, and end in a whimper. Ours are written in the bedrock of worlds. Beats told me about the Saiyans of your original dimension, and about how they were conquerors and planet sellers. Though you hide it, this code is within your DNA, Broly. Broly's gaze followed the gesture, taken into absolute horror Omni-Man so casually dismissed. He saw a single dust-covered shoe lying in the rubble. He heard the desperate cry of a child from a collapsed building, the last vestiges of confusion. The hope that this was some nightmare of manipulation evaporated. This was the man's true face. Broly slowly lifted his head, his dark eyes narrowing, not in a berserker fury, but with a cold, crystalline focus that was far more terrifying. The grogginess in him was gone, burned away by a grief as vast as the crater he now stood in. I don't know what happened to you. Broly's voice was a low, gravelly tremor, yet it carried over the sirens with absolute clarity. I don't know what pain or poison turned you into this hollow thing that seems life is kindling for its own fire. He took a single deliberate step forward, the ground cracking under his feet. The faint emerald aura around him, which had once flickered with unstable rage, now ignited into a steady, controlled inferno. It didn't roar. It hummed with a lethal intent. But your lectures are over, Broly stated, his words final and absolute. You can stop talking now. You will pay for every life here. And with that, he leaped from the crater, now ready to start the real battle. Alright, I think there'll be 2 episodes after this, man. Hope you guys enjoyed it. You already know what to do. Like, share, subscribe, super chats if you want to, man. Memberships are open, all that. I'll catch y'all on the next one. Peace.